call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting 103 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Finance, and now pursuant to Standing Order 83.1 and the motion adopted by the committee on Thursday, June 8, 2023, the committee is meeting to discuss the pre-budget consultations in advance of the 2024 budget. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. I would like to make a few comments for the benefit of the witnesses and members. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you are not speaking. Interpretation for those on Zoom, you have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either Floor, English, or French. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. Although this room is equipped with a powerful audio system, feedback events can occur. These can be extremely harmful to interpreters and cause serious injuries. The most common cause of sound feedback is an earpiece worn too close to a microphone. We therefore ask that all participants exercise a high degree of caution when handling the earpieces, especially when your microphone or your neighbor's microphone is turned on. In order to prevent incidents and safeguard the hearing health of our interpreters, I invite participants to ensure that they speak into the microphone into which their headset is plugged in, and to avoid manipulating the earbuds by placing them on the table away from the microphone when they are not in use. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. For members in the room, if you wish to speak, please raise your hand. For members on Zoom, please use the raised hand function. The clerk and I will manage the speaking order as best we can. And we appreciate your patience and understanding in this regard. In accordance with the committee's routine motion concerning connection tests for witness, I've been informed that everybody has been tested, and we are good. Clerk, yes, okay, and everybody is good on the sound. So, with us today are witnesses. As an individual, we have a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, Mr. Philip Cross. Welcome. As an individual, also, we've got Associate Professor of Economics and Philosophy at Carleton University, Vivek Deja. From the Canadian Federation of Agriculture, its President, Keith Curry, has joined us, as well as the Director of Government Relations and Farm Policy, Brody Bergen. Now, for the Collectif Hèche au Paradis Fiscaux, we have Monsieur Philippe Hurtaud, who is the member of the Coordination Committee. And coordinator, we have Mr. Edgar Lopez Aslin, who is be joining us, and they will be doing that via video conference. From the Council of Canadian Innovators, Laurent Carbonneau, who's the Director of Policy and Research, and Nicholas Schiavo, who's the Director of Federal Affairs. And our group of witnesses from the Public Service Alliance of Canada. Chris Aylward, who's the National President, is joining us, as well as Michelle Girache, who's the National Political Action Officer. So welcome to all of you. You'll have an opportunity to make a statement of testimony up to 5 minutes. And we're going to start with Mr. Philip Cross, please, for 5 minutes.
Okay, thanks for inviting me back. Inflation as measured by the CPI accelerated from 2.8% in June to 3.3% in July and 4% in August. The upturn was widely expected by analysts, including those at the Bank of Canada, because of base year effects. Basically, the drop in gasoline prices last year is being replaced in the index by this summer's high gasoline prices. However, there is more than energy prices pushing up inflation. Measures of core inflation remain stubbornly near 4%, even as lower gasoline prices pull down headline inflation. The cost of services rose 4.3%, led by a surge in shelter, notably a 6.5% increase for renters, as Canada's housing shortage worsened. It is remarkable that the Bank of Canada and the Federal Reserve Board, in their latest projections, do not see inflation returning to its target level until 2025. This admission of failing to achieve their inflation target for another 2 years was not accompanied by a change in policy. However, the growing realization that inflation will be higher for longer is pushing up longer-term interest rates anyway. It was predictable that the deceleration of inflation during the first half of 2023 would not last. Most of the easing of headline inflation was due to the resolution of some supply issues, notably in the energy sector, after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The underlying trend of demand has barely slowed outside of new home construction, suggesting that interest rates still are not high enough to substantially lower demand. This is especially true in an environment where governments continue to run deficits, notably in the U.S., where the federal deficit of 8% of GDP in the year ending in July is stimulus usually associated with wars and not an economy operating at full employment. Meanwhile, households still have substantial savings accumulated from excessive government transfers during 2020 and 2021. One result is that after an initial downturn in the spring in response to higher interest rates, house sales began to heat up again over the summer after the Bank of Canada prematurely indicated it would pause in further interest rate hikes. The ongoing imbalance between aggregate demand and supply is reflected in continued low levels of unemployment. Low unemployment puts upward pressure on wages, where increases in average hourly earnings remain close to 5%. The upward pressure on wages is continuing to build with several high-profile strikes across North America. While an understandable reaction to higher inflation, continued high wage inflation risks making it difficult to return to 2% inflation. Fed Chair Jerome Powell recently said that wage increases of 3 to 3.5% were consistent with its 2% inflation target. The implication is that sustaining current wage growth of well over 4% is not. It is difficult to analyze the labor market after the pandemic. Many workers left their job during the pandemic, especially workers in low-wage services jobs such as accommodation and food and retailing. There was speculation these workers would move to higher-paying jobs or upgrade their skills by returning to school. In the short run, we did see severe labor shortages in these industries. However, there has been no improvement in aggregate labor productivity. In fact, labor productivity has worsened significantly since early 2021, with 8 declines in the last quarters, and the only increase was 0.1% for a total drop of nearly 6%. The slump in productivity cannot be blamed on the pandemic, as labor productivity in the U.S. fared markedly better than in Canada. Comparing Canada, I'm going to skip a paragraph for the translators. Comparing Canada and the U.S. also shows another glaring missed opportunity. Oil and gas production in the U.S. has risen 40% since 2017, fueled by the technological innovation of fracking and higher prices, especially in Asia and then Europe after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Faced with these same opportunities, oil and gas output eked out less than a 10% gain, hampered by a lack of pipeline capacity and regulatory uncertainty surrounding oil and gas extraction. It is striking that the same circumstances produce such different results in Canada and the U.S. The surge in the U.S. shows there clearly was a business case to increase production. Nor did higher oil and gas production prevent the U.S. from substantial reductions in greenhouse gas emissions during this period, down 14% from its 2005 baseline versus only a 5% drop in Canada. Canada's attempt to straddle the middle of the road between the opposing lanes of faster economic growth and lower emissions led to its being run over in both directions. We have achieved little economic income growth without lowering emissions significantly. Underachieving has become habitual in Canada over the past decade, as we have ignored or even been outright contemptuous of entrepreneurship and innovation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cross. And now we'll hear from Mr. Degia.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't think this is on me. We're good now. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Canada's economy today stands at a crossroads. For the last quarter for which we have data, GDP actually contracted. Inflation just clocked in at 4%, still well above the Bank of Canada's target. More rate increases, therefore, could be on the horizon. Households in Canada have amongst the highest debt of any G7 country. Coupled with high house prices and insufficient new housing, many middle-class families can no longer afford to own a home, and many are fearful that they won't be able to afford the monthly payments on homes they already own as rates keep ticking up and stay high. There is a homeless and drugs crisis on our streets, making people feel unsafe. You just have to walk about 5 minutes from here to see that for yourself. Meanwhile, the government's massive fiscal stimulus has reaped mixed dividends at best. A recent Fraser Institute study shows that most of the job creation in Canada since the pandemic has been in the public sector and not the private sector. In other words, our economy is becoming more socialized. We've created not enough new good jobs and new business to power growth into the future. In fact, Canada is probably at present the worst performer in the G7 after Germany. I had warned as long ago as the fall of 2021 in the National Post, and before this committee about a year ago, that the Bank of Canada needed to get serious about inflation. It was not transitory and supply shocks and Ukraine. The bank, in my judgment, began acting too late, and the problem has gotten worse. They now have to be more aggressive to fix the problem, and that is making life difficult for all of us who owe money, that's most of us, while it profits only the wealthy who have spare cash to invest. Where do we go from here? There's a real danger that we will fall back into stagflation, that is, stagnation in the economy and high inflation. We've seen this movie before in the 1970s and again in Canada in the 1980s, and we know it doesn't end well, as we've seen also with wage and price controls at that time. We seem to have forgotten the important lessons which were painfully learned. The recipe for success is prudent fiscal policy, sound money, and sensible regulation that protects consumers whilst not stifling business in red tape. That is the formula we used in Canada to right the ship under governments of different parties. In Canada now we have the opposite situation: profligate government spending, the long-lasting harmful effects of loose money and stifling regulation are giving us low growth, high inflation in a doing business environment that chokes new business creation and gives us low growth compared to our G7 peer group, and means that prospects for many young people coming into the workforce or looking to start a business are increasingly dim. In thinking about the next budget, my suggestion to the committee is to look at the things we did right that gave us a booming economy and what is wrong now. We need a combination of sensible tax cuts and spending cuts that helps us balance the government's books in a prudent manner while lifting the burden on average Canadians. We need to hold the Bank of Canada accountable for their mandate to protect the value of our currency and not allow loose, irresponsible monetary policies that have created our present inflation and affordability crisis. And finally, we need to pare back excessive government interference in the economy that kills entrepreneurship and holds the economy back. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And now we'll go to the Canadian Federation of Agriculture and its president, Mr. Keith Curry, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And for those of you who do not know me, yes, the chair did introduce me, but I am an eighth-generation farmer here in Canada, and I represent the Canadian Federation of Agriculture, which is Canada's largest general farm organization, representing nearly 190,000 farmers and farm families and ranchers right across this great country of ours. And for those of you that had the benefit of eating today, on behalf of our farmers, we thank you for choosing good quality Canadian food. Thank you. Our sector has emerged from the global pandemic, like many others, into a high inflation and high interest rate environment. And as a result, the cost of critical farm inputs such as fuel, fertilizer, feed, machinery, crop protection products, land, and even labor have increased dramatically over the past few years, putting tremendous pressure on producers' farm financial health. Recent numbers from Stats Canada have shown that our net income has dropped by almost 10% in 2022, mostly due to the growth in expenses that outpaced the rise in farm incomes. When coupled with an increasing series of extreme weather events that are testing the limits and effectiveness of Canada's suite of risk management programs, Canadian farmers are challenged like never before to meet Canada's ambitious climate change objectives. In this context, our pre-budget submission lays out a series of recommendations aimed at ensuring farmers have flexibility and tools they need to weather the current financial climate and support the transition to a low-carbon economy. At the end of the day, our concern is that we don't want financial insecurity to undermine our sector's ability and commitment to produce affordable food, nor supporting our sustainable objectives. I'll focus my comments on a subset of recommendations which illustrate our priorities for Budget 2024. First, under the theme of helping farmers manage the increased cost of production, we're recommending that this government continue to support farmers through the Advance Payment Program. Specifically, we need the interest-free limit for advances under APP to be increased on a permanent basis to a level commensurate with today's increased cost of production and high inflation around critical farm inputs to ensure the program maintains its utility as a source of critical cash flow support. Furthermore, one of the most effective ways to meet the dual challenge of increasing productivity while at the same time reducing emissions is through technology and innovation. That's why our second priority recommendation is that the Government of Canada introduce a permanent accelerated capital cost allowance across all classes of farm equipment that would allow producers to depreciate 100% of their capital allocated to purchases of farm equipment for the fiscal year. This would support farmers in making necessary investments in technologies that improve their environmental performance at a time of increased financial pressures that would otherwise make access to working capital a real challenge. Our third priority falls under the theme of ensuring risk management programs are responsive to today's threats. Increasing incidents of extreme weather events across Canada are having a direct impact on Canadian producers on a scale not seen in generations. That's why we're recommending that AAFC start the process of revising key risk management programs, including, in particular, agri-recovery, to ensure that they are more timely, responsive, and predictable in the face of increasing disaster-related events caused by climate change. Our fourth priority falls under the theme of ensuring sustainability initiatives are farmer-focused and provide support to help adapt to the effects of climate change. If the sustainable agriculture strategy is going to position the sector to advance agriculture's capacity as a climate solutions provider while remaining competitive, we need to ensure a whole-of-government approach to support robust incentives for the adoption of best management practices and are put in place alongside investments to advance research and extension services to ensure farmers have on-the-ground support for best managed practices adoption. And finally, under the theme of supporting farm succession and the next generation of farmers, we're recommending that lifetime capital gains exemption be increased to reflect inflation in farmland values and other capital costs, and that provisions advance through Budget 2023's commitment to regulate intergenerational transfers do not discourage genuine family transfers from taking place. Taken together, these measures will create a more favorable tax environment for younger generations of farmers seeking to enter the sector and continuing the long tradition of farming here in Canada. Thanks for this opportunity to speak today, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Curry, and for your opening statement and the 200,000 plus farm families that you represent. Really appreciate that. Now we'll hear from the Collectif chez au Paradis Fiscaux. And I believe it's via video conference. Mr. Edgar Lopez Aslan will be providing a statement for up to 5 minutes.
Merci, monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson, members of Parliament. Hello, as you said, I am Mr. Gosselin, and I work at the Stop Tax Havens, and I'm accompanied by Philippe Horteau, who's a member of the Coordination Committee, and I am the coordinator. And he's also a member, as I said, of the Coordination Committee. So we're representing the Stop Tax Havens. We were created in 2010, and we bring together Quebec civil society organizations from trade unions, student, grassroots, community and economic sectors. Our organization now represents approximately 1.7 million members across the province. Our organization has 20 members, and that is 1.7 million people across the province of Quebec. So let me turn back to the figures about tax avoidance in Canada. According to the report on the overall federal tax gap published by the CRA in June 2022, the net federal tax gap for 2018 is estimated at $18.1 and $23.4 billion. According to the same report, non-compliance by large companies, including multinationals, obviously, is responsible for 70% of the corporate income tax gap. So our political perspective is quite specific. It is focused on grassroots, citizen-centric, democratic approach on the fight for tax justice. The collective's members are mounting a full-blown political response to a problem that is all too often presented as the sole preserver specialist. The collective's message, or catch cry, can be summed up in 3 key words: to combat tax avoidance, we need to unmask. In a world where secrecy is a rule of thumb, we have to condemn, denounce by way of the criminal justice system to deter violators, and then we have to collect the lost sums of money in order to better fund our public services. So these three key words, unmask, denounce and collect, are the backbone to a raft of political and policy demands which we've laid out in the pages of our consultative brief. So now I'd like to highlight a number of advances achieved by the Parliament of Canada and the Finance Committee when it comes to these demands. And we'd particularly like to highlight the progress made in the following areas. C42, implementation of the Canadian Registry on Beneficial Owners, and modernisation of the General Anti-Avoidance Rules, the GAAR. These are two initiatives that we have supported for years. Obviously, the legislation hasn't been enacted yet. The onus is on the Parliament to make good on this, but it's our estimation that given that there are discussions underway, well, this amounts to a major advancement in order to combat tax havens in Canada. So I'll wrap up my presentation by highlighting a few priorities for the upcoming year. First, the recent legislative consultations and the role of the UN when it comes to international tax cooperation. Now, recent legislative consultations. The collective has misgivings about the democratic deficit in the latest legislative consultations on tax policy, in particular those on the reform and modernisation of Canada's transfer pricing rules, and on the implementation of the global minimum tax. The federal government has accustomed the Canadian public to a democratic approach to these topics by opening the door to a dialogue on a wide range of issues. Unfortunately, the recent consultative process has considerably reduced these opportunities for dialogue by favouring the study of draft legislation that is based on discussions at OECD bodies, as opposed to a genuine democratic exchange with stakeholders, civil society stakeholders. There are, however, well-known alternatives to the solutions currently being studied by the Canadian government, and we believe that the Canadian government or public should be able to debate these openly and democratically. When it comes to the role of the UN in international tax cooperation, we invite Canadian elected representatives to pay particular attention to the initiative to strengthen the role of the United Nations when it comes to international cooperation on tax matters. The OECD, through BEPS, base erosion profit shifting, and the two-pillar solution has done a great deal of clean up tax relations between countries. However, these initiatives have not delivered the reforms expected by civil society. So, in our opinion, the UN tax initiative deliberations are a golden opportunity to move forward with these reforms that begun under the aegis of the OECD. We hope that Canada will take full advantage of this new window of opportunity to forge ahead with these crucial reforms. Thank you very much.
Lopez Aslan. And now we will hear from the Council of Canadian Innovators. I believe it's Mr. Nicholas Schiavo is going to be speaking for up to 5 minutes, please. Thanks.
Good morning to the chair, to the vice chairs, and the members of the Standing Committee on Finance. And thank you for the opportunity to present the Council of Canadian Innovators recommendations in advance of the 2024 budget. My name is Nick Schiavo, and I'm appearing today as the Director of Federal Affairs on behalf of CCI. And I'm joined by my colleague Laurent Carbonneau, our Director of Policy and Research. CCI is a national business council representing 150 of Canada's leading technology companies. We are dedicated to advocating for policies that promote innovation, economic growth, and long-term prosperity for all Canadians. Our member companies are headquartered here in Canada, employ north of 52,000 employees across Canada, and are market leaders in the sectors of health, clean, financial technologies, cybersecurity, AI, and more. Last week, these 150 CEOs were in Ottawa for Canada's CEO Summit to share their successes and challenges that face their business, their priorities, and how the Government of Canada can support them in their global pursuit of scale. I look forward to sharing some of these discussions with you today. As we approach Budget 2024, CCI recognizes that Canada's economy faces real challenges. Despite our strengths, slowing productivity growth is a threat to Canadian prosperity and our standard of living. Likewise, shifting geopolitical tensions underscore the need to take security in the digital world much more seriously. There has never been a greater need for a strong, stable domestic technology industry that can create long-term economic growth. Our nation possesses a wealth of talent, creativity, and innovation potential, but Canada must develop and implement smart industrial strategy that builds wealth and resilience in coordination with the provinces and territories. A smart industrial strategy begins with recognizing that in a globalized, knowledge and data-driven economy, companies compete on realizing the value of intangible assets like intellectual property rather than raw materials. Canada must ensure that our most innovative companies can scale and compete, catalyzing a flywheel of reinvestment and business know-how that will build wealth and serve as a solid foundation for a more competitive Canadian economy. Acknowledging this, CCI developed our Budget 2024 recommendations around three key themes: unleashing economic growth by enhancing marketplace frameworks, increasing the global competitiveness of Canadian businesses by expanding access to customers, and increasing return on investment by streamlining access to government capital. Let's delve deeper into some of the recommendations from our pre-budget submission, starting with artificial intelligence. Despite the Pan-Canadian Artificial Intelligence Strategy's launch in 2017, the Canadian government's efforts have not adequately bolstered domestic firms in the commercialization of intellectual property. This oversight has resulted in a regrettable exodus of talent and patents to other jurisdictions, severely compromising the competitiveness of the Canadian AI industry. To remedy this, we propose the development of a dedicated AI commercialization and IP strategy, with a focus on scaling our domestic AI technology firms. I encourage you to review our recent roadmap for responsible AI leadership in Canada, which provides comprehensive insights into this crucial endeavor and understanding the innovation economy driven by IP, data, and other intangible assets. Staying on this topic, in the intangible economy, foreign direct investment, or FDI, requires careful analysis to understand both the positive and negative impacts to domestic technology firms. Unlike in the tangible, production-based economy, where most foreign investments result in positive economic spillovers, the innovation economy often sees FDI take the form of a business in one country gaining ownership of a foreign branch plant in another, leading to negative spillovers. We strongly advocate for a comprehensive examination of the adverse consequences of FDI in the technology sector, particularly with regard to talent acquisition. Moreover, in the upcoming budget, we hope to see a commitment for a comprehensive review of innovation programs to eliminate duplication and establish freedom to operate structures, or FTO. FTO is indispensable for encouraging increased business expenditure on R&D, thereby fortifying our economy's productivity. Likewise, the imminent launch of the Canada Innovation Corporation should prioritize addressing FTO issues, which have hindered increased business expenditure on R&D by Canadian companies. I have included a copy of our recent economic newsletter, MooseWorks, which focuses specifically on freedom to operate challenges of high-growth companies. I was informed by the clerk that I think my email didn't go through, so apologies to the members of the committee. I will follow up with that. Complementing a review of innovation programs should be a comprehensive review of all capital programs designed to support innovators, encompassing the Scientific Research and Experimental Development Tax Credit, or SHRED, the Business Development Bank of Canada, the Strategic Innovation Fund, and the regional development agencies. Our members believe that the government should prioritize grants over loans, augment funding thresholds where it makes sense, and mandate the formulation of strategic IP plans to yield sustained economic dividends for Canada. In conclusion, these recommendations are more than mere policy proposals. They serve as a strategic blueprint to revitalize Canada's innovation ecosystem, foster economic growth, and secure our nation's prosperity. Our members want to collaborate with the government and this esteemed committee to implement these pivotal measures, all of which are designed for the benefit of all Canadians. Thank you for your time today. We look forward to addressing your questions and engaging in further discussion regarding these recommendations.
Well, thank you, Mr. Schiavo. And now we'll hear from the National President of the Public Service Alliance of Canada, Mr. Chris Aylward, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the members of the committee for this opportunity. The Public Service Alliance of Canada is the largest federal public sector union representing over 230,000 workers. Today, I will speak about three critical issues that impact these members in the federal public service. Our submission does provide additional information that I hope the committee will also consider. First, the release of the 2024 federal budget will occur just before the 8th anniversary of the onset of the Phoenix pay disaster. There have been errors in each and every pay period since it was implemented in 2016. Tens of thousands of public sector employees, including some now retired, in other jobs, or deceased, have yet to receive outstanding pay. This has impacted their benefits, their retirement pensions, their severance pay, and their ability to advance their careers. Yet, the government is currently focused on recovering overpayments, regardless of the ongoing harm to its own employees, even though they are still unable to pay their employees either correctly or on time. While some increases in hiring of pay advisors have occurred, the government must find ways to not only hire and train these employees, but also retain them. Attrition is too high, resulting in constant turnover and loss of expertise from the Pay Center program. The negotiated memorandum of agreement on damages expired in April of 2020. Yet, pay problems continue for federal workers in all bargaining groups. The memorandum of agreement needs to be renewed. And finally, it is time for a national inquiry into why this crisis has happened, how could it have been prevented, and most importantly, why 8 years later it is still not fixed. Only through a thorough investigation will Canadians be sure that such a problem will be prevented in the future. Second, and equally concerning, are the proposed cuts to the federal public service announced in Budget 2023. Cutting $15 billion from the federal public service will create significant pressure to downsize the workforce at a time when the pressure on these services has never been greater. Over the past year, increasing attention has been paid to the lack of national government staffing plan and the reliance on private contractors to provide public services. While the 2023 budget committed to significantly cut outsourcing, there was no obvious corresponding investment to in-house staffing. A system-wide staffing plan should be developed that considers the needs of all who receive services, both within the government and in the public. This plan shall acknowledge the evidence that in-house provision of public services, including management consulting, results in a better quality of service at a more appropriate cost. No cuts should be planned until a system-wide analysis of staffing needs developed with bargaining agents is in place. Finally, Budget 2024 needs to put public safety officers employed by the federal government, including National Defense firefighters and CBSA border officers, on par with their counterparts who work in other jurisdictions. It's been several years now since Treasury Board made a commitment to these workers that they would be eligible to retire with full pensions after the same length of service as all other public safety officers within and outside of the federal government. This promise has yet to be fulfilled. Firefighters and border officers often put their lives on the line and face unique health and safety risks that increase with each additional year of service. By the time they reach eligibility for retirement, they are often managing a serious illness or coping with a disability. The workers who keep us safe by battling fires and protecting our borders deserve to retire in dignity. I thank you for your time today, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Aylward. And now there's going to be a lot of opportunity for questions. We're moving into our first round. And in our first round, for all the witnesses, each party will have up to 6 minutes to be able to ask you questions. We're starting with MP Morantz from the Conservatives for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. DeHasia, do I have that right?
Yes.
Oh, I want to ask you a question about Bill C-56 in the context of the comments you made about loose money, the money supply, and the effect that that can have on inflation. And what this bill is, it's basically the so-called Affordable Housing and Groceries Act. Now, for Canadians who are reading the title of this act, it might be reasonable for them to conclude that this bill is designed to make housing more affordable and groceries more affordable. But the reality is it doesn't do either of those things. And I want to draw your attention to the comments of Michael Osborne, who's the chair of Cozen O'Connor's Canadian Competition Law Practice. What he says of the bill, he says on this point, he says, competition law is not designed to solve macroeconomic problems like inflation. And what he's referring to is an amendment to the Competition Act, which would do a number of amendments, but the main amendment would be to get rid of something called the efficiencies defense, which is an argument that large corporations will make to support the idea that government should permit a merger. Mr. Osborne goes on to say that by design, competition law cannot limit increases in the money supply. That's the job of central banks. And that if a lack of competition is responsible for rising grocery prices, then competition law might help, but that the evidence does not support this. I wonder if you could give me your view of those comments.
Certainly. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I mean, I share concerns about this bill and the attempt to alter the competition law of Canada. Again, you know, keeping in the spirit of my remarks, I think we've really unlearned the lessons we learned in the 1970s and 80s. You know, we saw wage and price controls under the previous government in the 70s, Pierre Trudeau's government, and that just didn't work. And this is a basic lesson that economists have known for decades or longer, that wage and price controls never fix inflation or lower prices. All they do is cause scarcity. And again, our previous flirtation with wage and price controls, the same thing in the U.S. under President Nixon, was disastrous. So you can't fix inflation till you recognize that loose monetary policy, let loose after the financial crisis and the pandemic, that's the real culprit. And wage and price controls or tinkering with competition law won't fix that problem.
Yeah, and I think that's consistent with the point that Mr. Osborne is making. I know that actually the Business Council of Canada has also been highly critical of the bill. They've said Ottawa wants Canadians to think the bill will improve affordability for families by giving consumers more choice, but this is not its purpose or what it will achieve. So there's a lot of concerns about the bill. Of course, you know, conservatives support the idea of removing the efficiencies defense, but we would never claim that it would be a tool to actually reduce the price of groceries, because, of course, that would be a false claim. Now, Mr. Cross, a couple of things. I just want to make sure we get you back on the record about some of the things that you said in the past. You said that one manifestation of chronic weak business investment and low productivity is the OECD's forecast that Canada's per capita GDP growth between 2020 and 2016 will be the lowest among its 29 members. This is something I think we really need to sound the alarm bells on. It's a very, very disturbing trend. And one of the things you said, which I thought was really quite apt, was you said that there's a growing sentiment in Canada that Canada has wasted a decade of low interest rates on more government debt rather than business investment. I wonder if you could elaborate on those sentiments.
Sure. One thing I'll add to the previous response before I get to your question is, just because something is given a name doesn't mean that's what the intent is. Biden has created something called the Inflation Reduction Act. It is the most inflationary source of upward pressure on prices in North America today. So just because an act is called a certain thing doesn't mean anything. But to go back to your question, I mean, yes, I go back to the I think the most telling remark I've heard recently is the comment by former Maclean's columnist Paul Wells, that if you run a successful business in this country, you're made to feel like you've done something wrong. I can't think of anything that summarizes better what has gone wrong with the climate for business investment and entrepreneurship in this country.
And I've heard you reiterate Mr. Wells' comment before. And I think what you're touching on is really a cultural difference between Canada and the United States, because you're absolutely right. You know, my 4 years in the House of Commons, every day I sit there and I listen to Liberal and NDP politicians beat up on successful business people when really their accomplishments should be lauded in our society. And they are lauded in American society. And I think that the sentiment that you and Mr. Wells described is quite correct. How am I for time, Mr.? I'm good. Thank you for your responses, gentlemen.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you, and there'll be more opportunity in for a few future rounds. MP Thompson now for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, and welcome to all the witnesses. I'm actually going to begin with the Council of Canadian Innovators. And if I could ask you the question, and Bill C-56, what your thoughts are on the competition aspects of the bill and the amendments. And either one of you, and actually both, please feel free to speak.
Sure. I'll say this. Look, we didn't come here to address that bill specifically, but that being said, CCI does believe that we need greater competition in Canada. We do agree that removing the efficiencies defense is a good first step. The reality is we have several sectors here in Canada that are monopolies, and that does cost Canadians more. For example, financial services. We were promised open banking in Canada by January of 2023, and we've yet to see that. And what that means is there's less competition, there's less innovation, there's less security, and all of that costs Canadians more. So the spirit of the bill, in terms of creating more competition, more innovation, we do support. Or I don't know if you have anything.
I would simply add on that the problem with the Canadian economy is certainly not that there's been too much competition in key oligopolistic sectors over the last several years. So as Nick said, we're broadly supportive of changes to the Competition Act. We've submitted a submission last spring pursuant to that, and I think especially removing the efficiency defense is a very good place to start.
Thank you. So, we realize that there's some innovation challenges, but what are your views on the competition reform and driving prosperity and innovation in Canada?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that's unique to our industry is that intangible assets like data are very different than kind of raw products. And so every data set that you own makes the previous one more valuable. They accentuate each other. And so without competition, it tends to favor those kind of data-hungry foreign multinational giants. So there is, I think, a unique element to our industry and to the intangible economy that may be different than some other sectors.
Yeah, I can add to that as well that just zooming out on kind of the broader dynamics of innovation, it's been pretty well observed over decades that there is a certain winner-take-most effect to innovation-heavy industries, and especially, as Nick said, industries where you have assets like data and IP that have the function of locking competitors out. And to some extent, that's a healthy dynamic. If you innovate and create a good product or service, then, like if you're able to commercialize that effectively, that's good. But there are limits to this, right? And I think what we've seen, especially with the big tech giants, is them sitting on IP that they've sort of extracted from this country via hiring, creating these research branch plants that they then commercialize the IP abroad and sell the products back to Canadians, and sitting on data assets that are, the product of a very large program of surveillance. This is essentially bad for Canadians and it's bad for competition. So the innovation dynamics of competition, I think, are a little bit underappreciated in the competition policy discourse in this country, and that's why we had our submission earlier this spring to kind of try to change the channel a little bit and I think increase awareness of how our sector is particularly impacted in the sort of competition policy space.
What are the benefits of a modernized Competition Act, and particularly when you're supporting Canadian scale-ups?
Yeah. Look, Canadian scale-ups are really those anchors of economic activity. Our problem here in Canada is that we have many strengths, a wealth of research and talent. We have more startups per capita than many countries in the OECD. But when they start to scale, when they start to commercialize and create products that are viable to create economic activity, this is often when we see them struggle, move to foreign jurisdictions, get bought out. And so without that, without commercializing those products and services, without creating that intellectual property that is going to create those economic rents for the long term, we're not going to see that effect on prosperity in the economy as a whole. And so our budget submission is really around how do we help these companies receive the freedom to operate, to scale, to succeed, and ultimately feed back into the Canadian economy.
Do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I would say that, we talked a little bit about smart industrial strategy in Nick's opening statement, and I think having a more open, competitive sort of innovation economy is part of that. And I think, zooming out, we have to look at these kind of dynamics, none of them in isolation, because Canada's had a long-standing productivity growth and innovation problem. It didn't happen overnight. It's kind of a product of industrial structure and public policy over many generations. Some of that, is kind of we're swimming against the current. Some of it is we've made bad choices. But all that to say that, competition policy very much part of the discussion around marketplace frameworks that we should be having. It's not the only one, but definitely, I think this is there are some steps in the right direction around the efficiencies defense.
Thank you. And in your opening comments, I did pick up on two things, one being grants over loans, and you've referenced that, but you also mentioned talent acquisition. Would you just provide some more background on that and why it's important?
Yeah, absolutely. Often what happens is when you have these foreign multinationals that come into Canada and they operate a branch plant, not only are they gobbling up the intellectual property, the ingenuity that creates those economic rents, but they also gobble up talent. Now, ultimately, Canadians, we want them to have, good paying jobs and they're free to go where they want. But by gobbling up that talent, you're pulling from that ecosystem, and all of those smaller players, those scale-ups, are now starved for the talent they need to grow. And as a result, they are either shuttering their doors or considering other options in other jurisdictions. So again, when we talk about foreign direct investment, when we talk about these foreign multinationals, we are for a level playing field. Of course, they're welcome to come here and invest, but we need to make sure that those adverse impacts are taken into consideration on the economy as a whole and the labor force.
Time, and thank you. I know it goes quickly. MP Thompson, thank you very much, and thanks to the witnesses for that testimony. Now we're moving to the block, and MP Saint-Marie, please.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson. I'll start with a point of order, if I may. I'd like to call on the clerk. Last week, we had a witness, the SCHL, Canada Mortgaging and Housing Corporation. We asked for a breakdown of data by province regarding the minister's powers and authority. There was also an update requested regarding the growth rate of the population that would better reflect the reality. Now, when it comes to that growth rate, apparently it'll take a couple of weeks to get that information, but I'd like to ask the clerk, in relation to the other matters, have we received responses regarding the CMHC? Mr. Saint-Marie, we still haven't received anything. It will take a couple of weeks. I don't know if they're going to wait to send everything all at once, but I can reach out to them and ask them to send what they have right now and then take a bit of time to send the rest later. That would be most appreciated. Thank you very much. That's the end of my point of order. Hello, gentlemen. I won't say ladies because there are no female witnesses today. That said, once again, we have a highly interesting and informative panel, and it's not just because we don't have time to ask you questions that we're not going to retain your suggestions and include it in our consultative report. We're taking copious notes and we're highly appreciative of your attendance. My question will be for the Stop Tax Haven Collective, Mr. Hurto and Mr. Lopez Aslan. Thank you very much for your presentation and for the documents that you submitted to the committee. First, the OECD and G20 proposed a 20% minimum global tax, which in your opinion is insufficient. Do you know where we're at when it comes to the fact that the Chamber of Representatives in the United States don't wish to, in fact, ratify that global taxation minimum? Do you have any further information to share with us? Thank you very much for your question, Mr. Saint-Marie. Now, as far as the state of affairs in the US is concerned and the updating of Pillar 2 of the global minimum taxation rate, the update factored in the rules that were adopted in the United States or in the process of being so. So one has to consider the original figures that were compiled by the OECD, which take into account, how should I put this, the enactment of legislation that would be somewhat analogous, but not exactly what the OECD advocated for. Now, in Canada, the federal government is getting ready to adopt this primary rule in this regard, and we have a sense that there seems to be a consensus among G20 countries around this matter. and also in civil society and non-government organisations. There have been a number of criticisms about the threshold of 15% that is far too low compared to the real taxation rates that are practiced by the lion's share of OECD countries, not to mention developing countries. And the forum, OECD forum, is apparently not open enough and does not allow developing countries to have equitable access to the deliberations on these issues. So for the time being, they're the broad brushstrokes. We have an agreement. There is a consensus. What remains to be seen is whether the UN initiative will or will not be able to bring to bear the necessary reforms. Thank you very much. As far as the global minimum taxation is concerned, which is insufficient in your opinion, in Ottawa we're discussing taxing the web giants and a large share of their sales figures and turnover. What's your opinion about that? Should the government go ahead in the interim while there's still no global minimum tax rate? Thank you for the question. We're in favour of that measure with a couple of nuances. It's not the ideal tool. It's highly likely that the additional cost of that tax will be handed off onto consumers. But as we wait for the implementation of Pillar 2, which is unfortunately still on the back burner, there's no consensus when it comes to the implementation rules, we believe that the tax on digital services is the bare minimum to ensure that web giants pay their fair share to the Canadian Treasury. Thank you again for that question. Now, in your brief on pre-budgetary consultations, as you said, you made 13 recommendations. I have 2 minutes left, Mr. Chair. Is that correct? So, 2 minutes. Could you please elaborate on some of them? And I'll have another round later, and you'll be able to elaborate further then. Of course. Just give me a moment, if I may. Well, let me talk about the unitary tax, which is been in place for about 40 years and being advocated by researchers and economists and the vast majority of international organisations on tax matters. So this unitary taxation allows us to stop the current practice of transfer payments, which are not able to be compared, apples and oranges. So the big multinationals that go after subsidiaries will focus on transactions between two corporations that are not affiliated. So today, with the country-by-country declaration, we have more information than ever to shed light on this phenomenon, and yet we don't have any methodology to fully leverage that information. So the unitary tax, essentially, is about treating each and every multinational as a unique and distinct company. So the total sum of profits posted by those multinational companies across all countries will be factored in. And those profits will be based on the calculation of those profits will be based on their real activities across various countries. And there are a number of indicators to determine this. The wage base, mining natural resources, market shares, and so on and so forth. But it's a far cry from having a full understanding of that yet. The numerous subsidiaries of multinationals continue to be treated separately, and there's a refusal to acknowledge that the multinationals is an economic model which is really different to nationalised companies, for example, that don't have access to the benefits under that kind of format. And I can come back a bit later about the GAAR, the General Anti-Avoidance Rules. On 2 occasions, we took part in the consultative process on that legislation, and we're very pleased at the progress being made by the federal government, who's doing an excellent job.
Merci, nous y reviendrons. And there will be more time.
We'll get back to you later.
Now we're going to video conference, and MP Blakey, I think, coming to us from probably Winnipeg, right?
Indeed, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much. To Mr. Alward, I wanted to follow up on some of your presentation about Phoenix, and I wanted to ask, before, either before electronic payroll at all, and certainly before Phoenix. I mean, was there anything like this scale of problem that we're seeing in making payroll for the government of Canada?
No, not at all. Nothing close to this scale at all. We're talking a pay system that affects 300,000 people, and it has never worked right from day one in 2016, and it's still not working right in 2023. So, Daniel, sorry for the question. Thanks for the question, but no, I've never seen anything on this scale like Phoenix.
And there are other organizations with large payrolls with hundreds of thousands of people on them, are there not, that are able to properly pay employees according to the predetermined pay period? Am I right, or is this a problem of scale, or is this a problem that's very particular in this case to the government of Canada?
No, it is very much a government of Canada problem. Again, we've never seen anything like this. With the government of Canada not being able to pay its own employees on time and properly, that's why we're calling for a national inquiry into this. Because 8 years later, and we're still, federal public sector workers are still not being paid properly. So, and some
Indeed.
Conservative members, unfortunately, of this committee think that's funny, and that's a joke. Unfortunately, for our 140,000 federal public sector workers that we represent in the federal public service, is no joke and is no laughing matter when you can't get paid on time. I did not appreciate the laughter coming from the Conservatives on this, Mr. Chair. We're talking about federal public sector workers not being paid on time and properly, and the Conservatives thinks that's funny. Sorry, I take offense to that.
Can I just respond to that point of order? I do not think that's funny at all. What I was saying is that something that the Conservatives have been mentioning for 8 years, that everything in this country feels broken. And so we are 100% on board. This Phoenix system should have been broken, should have been fixed a long time ago.
Thank you.
I'm 100% agreement with you, sir.
Thank you.
Very well. Well, and I can certainly understand strong feelings. I've heard from a lot of folks in Elmwood Transcona who work for the federal public service who have had their lives turned upside down by the failure of government to make payroll in a timely way. And I appreciate the point you made in the opening statement about the government putting the emphasis on recovering overpayments instead of ensuring that people are getting what they are entitled to for the work that they do, and that they set their monthly budget according to as well. And we know that when there's big shortfalls in your monthly budget, that makes a big difference. I'm wondering, can you share with the committee, I know you spoke to some of this during your opening remarks, but what are some of the things that you think could be done right away? I mean, I remember years ago suggesting to government, that if they had to devolve payroll to local managers and do it by hand, it looked like we'd be a lot better off than what they're currently trying to do. And they've persisted in the strategy of trying to use an electronic payroll system that simply doesn't work. I don't think anyone wants to see the government doing payroll by hand, but if it's better than the alternative, it's a reflection of the sorry state of the status quo. But there's got to be a way. If we could do government payroll well in the 70s, there's got to be a way that we can do it well today. What are some of the things you think government can be doing right now that it's not doing, that it needs to do in order to, at the very least, mitigate the negative consequences of this fiasco for its workers, with an eye to getting this sorted once and for all, so that Canadian federal workers can depend on a reliable paycheck according to the terms and conditions agreed to in their letter of offer?
For the question, certainly, pay in the federal government, it is complex. There's no question about that. And hiring more pay advisors, that does help, but there is a retention period with pay advisors. And so the government has to consider what incentives they're going to come up with to retain these pay advisors, because you simply can't hire a pay advisor today and expect them to perform all of the duties, including complex cases, within a couple of months. It takes 2 years to be fully trained to take on complex cases in the pay environment. So certainly incentives for retention, because there is a serious retention issue with pay advisors.
Now, I know earlier in the year, of course, there was the kind of culmination of a round of collective bargaining that I certainly don't think went as it should. I don't think government should have waited to the point where federal civil servants were prepared to walk out in a rather unprecedented way, or at least certainly not for a long time. I'm wondering how the issues that were at stake in bargaining affect retention and affect the federal government's ability to deliver both on fixing this payroll system issue, but also more generally on public services. How does the government retain the expertise that it needs to do a good job when its position in respect of its workforce is to try and argue for substandard wage increases in the economy we're experiencing, and to not bargain respectfully when it comes to some of those workplace challenges that all workplaces, including the federal service, are living in the post-pandemic era?
Yeah, I mean, certainly retention is a problem overall in the government. And again, you know, when the current government basically forces its workforce out on strike for decent wages and decent working conditions, I mean, obviously that just frustrates workers, and it causes workers then to start looking elsewhere. When you look at certain bargaining groups within the federal public service, and when you look at what the private sector are paying to do the same job, a lot of the federal public sector workers are underpaid. When you look at, like I said, across the board, private sector. So there's a lot of our members, I know, that are looking elsewhere and wanting to leave the public service. They thought public life was their career, and now realizing, no, maybe it's not, simply because of the working conditions.
Thank you, Mr. Ayler. Thank you, MP Blakey, and thank you, of course, to all our public service for their service and for their hard work. We are moving into our second round of questions, and at this time, the timings will change, but we have 5 minutes now for MP Lawrence, please.
Perfect. So first, if I don't have misinformation here, I believe it is the chair's birthday. So happy birthday, is that correct?
It is.
Happy birthday, Mr. Chair. And yes, happy 30th. Mr. Aylward, I wanted to apologize for laughing. I wasn't laughing at I have tremendous respect for public service workers, and it's absolutely, the only reason I was laughing is because it's embarrassing. It's absolutely deadpan embarrassing that a G7 country can't pay their workers. So I apologize, but the laughter was out of embarrassment for our country. Thank you for that. I want to talk to you, Mr. Cross, a little bit about inflation and a piece that you wrote. And when you talked about combating inflation, of course, we've heard a lot of the Bank of Canada, and the last time this came around is, as Mr. Deha talked about in the 1970s and the 80s, it was cured by very high rates of interest rates put in place by Mr. Volcker in the United States. And so one of the cures, and we've heard Mr. Macklin, he's had to increase interest rates, but you also talked that fiscal policy or government spending has an impact on that. And you even talked about in the 80s that part of the reason why inflation was able to get under control was that the government reduced spending. And I was wondering if you could just comment, Mr. Cross, a little bit about the impact that fiscal policy can have on inflation.
And not just fiscal policy. There's a wide range of government actions that influence prices. Excessive regulation pushes up prices every bit as much as excess government spending. We see. I remember when I was at Statistics Canada in 1980, when we were grappling with trying to understand inflation and how to bring it down. One of the innovations we brought about was we introduced something called the regulated price index for the CPI. We looked at that portion of the CPI that was controlled by government, either directly through taxation or through rent controls or control of marketing boards. And it turns out that was one of the problems in bringing down inflation in the early 1980s was the market portion of the CPI was coming down rapidly, but the regulated, the government-controlled portion of inflation was very slow to come down. So that, that might be something worth looking at again in the current context. I suspect we're seeing an adjustment in a lot of the markets parts of the economy, but in a lot of the government control of the economy, price increases are just rolling along without any awareness of the impact this is having on ordinary people.
Absolutely. And my concern, too, is that as opposed to a couple years ago when we heard low for long. We are now starting to hear from some experts, we may have high for long. We may have structural inflation. I think you used 2025. I've heard even longer than that. And for a simple politician like me, I'm going to give you a little analogy, and you guys are much smarter than me. But for a simple politician, for me, inflation is largely the product of demand being out of equilibrium or out of whack with supply, meaning that there are more people who want things than there are things available. So Halloween's coming up, so let's use the example of pumpkins. So we got 100 pumpkins, and we've got 200 people that want them. The result is the price goes up, right? So my thinking is, from a simple politician, is why don't we just increase the amount of pumpkins to bring supply into line with demand? Does that make sense to you from just a simple politician here?
It makes sense in a very simple way. The problem is that it's very hard to change supply in the short term. It takes years, for example, of investment to build more housing, to find more oil and gas. I mean, some of these projects in the energy sector take 10 years. So it's not like you just snap your fingers and bingo, there's more supply of energy or housing tomorrow. That's why in the very short term, because people are suffering in the short term, the Bank of Canada's number one tool is reducing demand. They can do that very quickly and efficiently through higher interest rates. Yeah. I'd also mention in passing, to the degree that we don't get follow-up from governments, if governments try to fight what the Bank of Canada is doing and increase transfer payments and send checks to people, quite understandably, they're trying to help people, but there doesn't seem to be an awareness that this is actually just makes the Bank of Canada's job more difficult. So if the Bank of Canada is left alone to fight inflation, then they're going to have to act more aggressively, and that's going to impact people in debtors in particular.
And now going to MP Baker, please, for 5 minutes.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here. We appreciate it. Nous avons beaucoup de témoins ici qui...
We have a lot of witnesses here today that have tremendous input to give, and as Gabrielle said, we won't be able to ask questions of all witnesses today. That said, we appreciate your suggestions and will certainly consider what you have to say today and what you submitted in terms of written briefs.
With the Council of Canadian Innovators, if I may, and continue along the lines of what my colleague, Ms. Thompson, was asking earlier. One of the things that has been announced is the Canadian Innovation Corporation. And I'm wondering if you could comment on your thoughts on how you see the potential of this corporation scaling up businesses and helping to commercialize research and innovation, boost, promote Canadian intellectual property, and more. Could you comment on that?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that question. Look, if the corporation achieves its full potential, as it's been announced in the blueprint and the messaging from government, I do think it'll be a radical departure from previous innovation programs. But I think the devil is in the details, and there's a lot of nuance there. One of the things that CCI has been very involved with is providing any support we can to the Department of Finance as they get ready to kind of launch this corporation in full, but particularly in terms of the leadership. We've been told that the chair and the CEO of the corporation will be from industry. We think that's very important, and we think that they have to have a good understanding of the intangible economy, the innovation economy, in order to see this as an evolution of IRAP, which will be assumed in this corporation. So we're eager to see some movement on that. We can't wait another year. This was promised years ago. We're looking forward to some announcements on that.
Yeah, if I can just expand slightly, I think if you look at sort of the history of innovation programming in this country, it's focused really on the inputs and on kind of crude outputs, which is to say, if we're spending research dollars, then innovation will come. And too often in Canada, that just hasn't been the case. So to take a very commercialization focused approach, I think is, as Nick said, a fairly substantial departure from what's been done before. I think it is a very interesting model. There is a lot of good evidence from abroad. Of course, it was built sort of on the model of the Israeli chief scientist and on Business Finland, which have both been quite successful as kind of peripheral agencies with a broad mandate to pursue change in a way that is insulated from kind of core day-to-day government, which has worked well in very different countries as well, I should add. So in that sense, we think that's the right model to look at, and we're encouraged. As Nick said, it is crucially important that the leadership of that corporation be sensitive to industry and be from industry, because I think very, very often in this country, and I say this with great respect to the post-secondary education institutions in this country, they have not been the key to unlocking productivity in this country and going along a simple research focus, which I will say research is an essential component of innovation, but it is not itself innovation, and turning research and insights into products that we export, sell, that drive wealth and productivity growth in this country is the essential ingredient that we're missing, and we hope that this will go some way to address that.
Right. So you have to go from research to commercialization is what you're saying, and we need to make sure that we reap the benefits of the commercialization.
Exactly.
Yeah. How much time do I have, Chair?
Just a little over a minute.
A little bit. So in my remaining minute, one of the things that there has been proposed is clawbacks to ensure that IP stays in Canada. You gentlemen spoke in your presentation to Ms. Thompson about the importance of not just IP being developed in Canada, but what we just talked about a moment ago, right, is that IP, that the rents, I think you called them, that the economic benefits of that remain in Canada. That doesn't just get taken by a company to the United States or another country, and that the economic benefits get reaped there. So what are your thoughts on those proposed clawbacks to ensure that IP remains in Canada?
Yeah, I would use the term payback, a little sloganeering there, but we're in support. If Canadian taxpayers are going to invest in these companies and in this intellectual property, and that intellectual property is then going to take flight, they should be required to pay back that investment to Canadians in multiples. This is what's expected of private investors. So we are in support of that, and we're eager to see that implemented into the corporation.
And I mentioned the foreign models earlier that this is based on. That is the case in those jurisdictions as well. So in that sense, it's kind of established practice. We think that's, as Nick said, a very good step. I'll also just say on a quick personal note, because I didn't say it earlier, I was a staffer in this place for some years, and it's very fun to be on the other side of the table. So I just want to thank the committee for inviting us today.
It is a great way to end it.
And welcome back. Yeah, at the table. So we are. That's my time. So on that, over to the block, and MP Sainte-Marie, please, for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson. First, I'd like to apologise to Ms. Girache, who is a female witness here in attendance today with the Public Service Alliance of Canada. This is a small room, and I didn't see your name badge, so my apologies. Now, I'll turn my attention now to Mr. Lopez-Asselin. You were starting to talk about the general anti-avoidance rule, if I'm not mistaken. Perhaps you'd care to further elaborate on the recommendations of your collective. Thank you very much, sir. I'll come back to the two recommendations from my original pitch. The GAAR, well, there have been considerable efforts made, and we advocate for the need to penalise those violators, not only to make them pay back those sums, but ensure that there are penalties put in place to further deter violators. That said, we're very happy with the progress made in that regard, and there's also the Registry for Beneficial Owners. There are a lot of discussions underway legislatively, and the matter isn't done and dusted, but I'd call on members of Parliament in Canada to ensure that the threshold of taxation that an individual would have to meet to become a beneficial owner would be set to 10%. And not 25%, which was a mistake that has been made by a number of countries, starting with the United Kingdom, which was the first to put in place a registry of that kind. Now, I'd like to elaborate on a number of our other recommendations. You asked me to do so. We also believe that one of our top recommendations under unveiling or unmasking is greater transparency on the part of the CRA and greater accountability. And last April, we took part in collective action in front of the Montreal CRC, demanding, crying out for greater transparency. So the CRA needs to take the necessary measures to make good on its mission statement. And at the same time, year in, year out, the CRA must present a report regarding budgetary activities. And we hope that the Minister for Finance will take action in that regard. Thank you very much.
Marie, and now to back to Winnipeg and MP Blakey. Yes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson. Mr. Lopez Asselin, we know that for decades, whether it be under the helm of a Conservative or Liberal government here in Ottawa, that the federal government of all stripes has let a lot of income and revenue fall through the gaps as a result of tax loopholes. In your opinion, why is the federal government happy to let so much revenue slip through the cracks? And at the end, the upshot of that is that revenue is not able to be productive. I'll defer to my colleague Philippe Urtault if he's still with us. Philippe? Yes, of course, and very concisely. We don't have a window into the government's mind, so we don't know exactly how things work, but it seems that they are reluctant to take action. And that reluctance has a domino effect and is a concern of the members that I represent that work in the social services sector. And this isn't only the case in Quebec. These individuals have come to grips with financial difficulties. They don't have the resources they need to pay their employees adequately and to provide proper services to the general public. And this has led to a lot of frustration that's been growing over the years. This inertia that you alluded to, sir, is completely incomprehensible, especially on the part of those who are trying to provide fulsome services to Canadians and Quebecers. And I can't explain that inertia. It's really hard to wrap your head around it. It's been the case for the past 20 years. Everyone knows that tax havens are an issue preventing governments worldwide from fulfilling their social missions. And when I say this out loud, as I am, well, unfortunately, the fact of the matter is there's inadequate action in this regard. Well, the fact remains that this is very ironic. And were we to hire folks to go after that lost revenue, which would pay for their own wages and allow the government to have more money to provide the services that Canadians need, well, listen, that doesn't amount just to a cost, it amounts to an investment. And therefore, the government would need to modify treaties that have been signed regarding taxation loopholes. But if we were able to just get that job done, we would have more financial resources at our disposal. So we're not just talking about more costs. We're talking about, in order for the government to do the right thing, have I summed things up accurately and painted an accurate picture of the situation?
Be in another round, but yeah, we're well over time. But thank you, MP Blakey, and I'm sure they'll have an opportunity to answer that in another round. We're going to the Conservatives, MP Helen, please, for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks to all the witnesses for being here. My questions will be for Mr. Cross and Mr. Dehijia. By the Liberals' own admission inside their budget, Canada's economic growth rate, or GDP per capita, will be the worst for many decades, until 2060 by their own admission. And on top of that, it'll be the worst in all of the OECD or developed countries. You both have mentioned about mistakes governments have made in the past, and also we're heading down a very kind of scary path right now. I'd love to get some more insight from both of you about similarities, about mistakes that governments are currently making from the past, And what are the consequences of these mistakes?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I mean, just briefly, I'm really perplexed and frankly disturbed that we've not learned the lessons from our mistakes in the 70s and 80s. I think Mr. Cross mentioned someone mentioned the John Crow disinflation, which was extremely painful. And we had that in Canada. The U.S. had fixed their problem by that point. So the kinds of ideas being talked about, wage and price controls, so forth, will only make the problem worse. We've got, again, it's the simple, and the ideas really are simple. We've got to have sensible regulation that protects consumers, obviously, but doesn't stifle business. Sound monetary policy, which has been sorely lacking, and now we're paying the price for a decade or more of loose money. And sound fiscal policy. We've had reckless fiscal deficits. So it's not that hard to figure out. And I'm afraid we seem to have unlearned the lessons of the 70s and 80s. It's really quite perplexing.
Thank you.
The thing I would add is what strikes me the most when I look at the current economic environment is the very strong upward pressure we're seeing on longer-term interest rates here and in the U.S. That's an acknowledgement by investors that inflation and interest rates are going to be higher for longer. It seems to be getting in, and we've seen the stock market back off as a result, and we're seeing cracks in demand in housing in Canada and the U.S. But I don't think people have realized yet the scale of what we're going through. We're ending a period of well over 10 years of low interest rates, almost free money. And we're returning to a world of more normal interest rates. That's going to be a shock. I think there's a lot of business models out there that were based on the assumption interest rates would stay low for a long time. And I think there's going to be a lot of fallout from this new regime. One obvious place, for example, would be commercial real estate. Coming out of the pandemic, we see vacancy rates of 50% in downtown. There's a lot of money, particularly in the private sector, went into investing in these. They borrowed at low rates. They invested in these buildings, and it's going to be difficult to make money in these investments. Sorry.
So a question for both of you again. We've seen the current Liberal Finance Minister, Chrystia Freeland, admit that deficits fuel inflation. Former Liberal Finance Minister John Manley summarized what's happening today is like the Liberal deficits are like pressing the gas, and the Bank of Canada is slamming on the brakes with higher interest rates. We've seen inflation at 40-year highs, but we've also seen this Liberal government spend more than every government before them combined. And at the end of the day, that made the Bank of Canada raise interest rates at rates at a rapid pace we haven't seen in 30 years. Do you, in both of your opinion, is the government's deficits and their spending and their policies today working against the monetary policies of the Bank of Canada?
I'll start briefly on that because I think I've already touched on that in one of my earlier answers, then I'll turn the majority of the time over to you. And I would add yes, but of course it's not just fiscal policy. As I mentioned too, there's a wide range of government decisions that affect prices. And we should be aware of all of these through regulations, taxes, decisions authorized by marketing supply management boards, for example. So you have to look at all government actions, not just spending. Sorry.
So no, I would just add to that. Yes, indeed. It's as if the federal government is pressing on the gas and the Bank of Canada is forced to press on the brakes even harder. So interest rates are high in part because we've still got massive fiscal deficits, and we just haven't learned the lesson. I mean, the massive spending in the pandemic has yielded very little in the way of productivity. So yes, indeed, a high fiscal deficit is worsening our problem, forcing the bank to have higher interest rates.
Thank you, and thank you, MP Helen. And now to MP Weiler, please.
Thank you, Chair. And I'd also like to thank all of our witnesses for being here today. Some really interesting testimony thus far. And I'd like to first ask my questions of the Canadian Federation for Agriculture. This has been a very difficult year in Canada with the extreme weather events that we're seeing right across the country. I mean, it's obviously been headlined by the worst wildfire season we've had in Canadian history, and that was by the end of June. So I know particularly in my province of BC, this has hit very hard with wildfires particularly impacting a lot of the key agricultural areas, including our most productive, some of our most productive crops. And I was wondering, Mr. Curry, Mr. Berrigan, if you could provide some information to this committee about the level of economic losses that you expect this year from the forest fires and other extreme weather events, and how you see this projecting forward over time.
Well, I'll start, and I can let Brody jump in and all the technical stuff because he's the smart one. I'm just here because of my good looks, I think. But it's not something you just recover from easily. Our farms are generational, and when you're devastated through a flood or through a drought or fires affect what's happening, it takes years to build back that capital that's lost in an instant. So to put an exact dollar on what that would look like is very difficult. But we do have some business risk management programs in place right now that, with some tweaking and changes, can actually make the programs responsive quicker to help out these farmers and ranchers that are affected by it. The Agri Recovery Program, I mean, there's been an ask from Saskatchewan that happened, I think, at the end of June or July, and we're still waiting to hear back from the government whether that's going to get approved or not. These people still have to live. They still have to pay their bills, all their expenses, without, in some cases, a dramatic loss of income or total loss of income. We can't have programs that are that slow in response. So we need to make some changes to programs like that. And I don't know, Brody, if you want to add more to that.
Thank you for the question. I think Keith's absolutely right. I mean, without the ability to speak to specific numbers in terms of impact losses, although we can certainly provide the committee with that information if it's interesting. I think the issue from our perspective is having a risk management framework in place that is responsive and timely and there to support farmers when they need it. And certainly we've seen, as Keith said in his introductory remark, an increasing incidence of extreme weather events across this country. I mean, floods, forest fires, drought, too much rain, not enough rain, hurricanes. It's really quite something. And the problem is our risk management framework is not equipped to deal with that level of incidence of extreme events. And so programs like Agri Recovery are just not as responsive as their U.S. equivalents and the U.S. Department of Agriculture, for example. And so when a drought hits Saskatchewan, and it's hitting that whole area into the U.S. farmers are able to access some emergency support and, purchase feed for their farmers much more quickly than we can here in Canada, which really puts us at a serious disadvantage. For example, I know that Saskatchewan has a request right now for an Agri Recovery program to support them for some drought conditions they've experienced. They put that request in July. We still haven't heard the response on that yet. And that's just the first step in the process. There are several that need to come after that before we actually will get some money. But thank you for the question.
Thank you. On a bit of a different track here, in your opening you mentioned the need of making sure that the sustainability initiatives are farmer-focused. In my riding, I've seen a number of, especially smaller scale farms, adopt particularly regenerative farming practices as a way that they've actually been able to increase production and sometimes actually reduce costs by having lower input costs. And when you mentioned that these sustainability initiatives need to be farmer-focused, I was hoping you could maybe speak a little bit more to that and how you see the government role in being able to help with the sharing of best practices as well as on the capital side as well.
There's a wide range of ways that the government can help farmers to be more focused. When it comes to sustainability initiatives, really what we want the government to do is be a partner, to work with us. The best laid plans that aren't practically implementable are not very useful to us. So we want to be a partner with the government to go forward on the various number of different types of practices and best management practices that we can use, keeping in mind that if you look across this country, no two regions are the same. We are very diverse right across the entire country, so it can't be a one-size-fits-all. There has to be flexibility built in within the program to allow farmers to adapt to what their specific geographic regional needs are, and even farming types that are there. But there are some basic principles like soil health is at the basis of everything. We're all worried about climate change, what's in the air. The reality is that doesn't matter. What's under our feet is what really matters the most, and that's going to be the solution to all things climate going forward. So we need to focus on soil health and practices across the country, depending on the climate and the soil type, how we improve the soil health under our feet, and there's myriad of other practices, technologies, for example. But technologies are only good if we have connectivity to be able to use the technology, and require a lot of investment too.
Thank you. And thank you, MP Weiler. And so members' witnesses, I'm just looking at the time. We just have enough time for one more round to get through. And I believe we're starting with MP Howland for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Chair. Once again, my questions are for Mr. Cross and Higia. We know that the demand for oil and gas is going to be strong until 2050. And Mr. Cross, you had mentioned about things like regulations, and about, we don't have enough pipelines in this country. We've been saying this for the last 8 years. We've seen a Liberal government that's anti-energy, anti-growth, and I think one of your papers, Mr. Cross, it literally says Canada's anti-business culture undermines our growth. We've seen anti-energy bills like Bill C-69, the No New Pipeline Bill. We've seen a carbon tax that hasn't really helped the environment or emissions come down, and it's just made the cost of everything go up. In both of your thoughts, would you agree that some of these laws and some of these really anti-energy bills are not letting Canada's growth rate increase and increase jobs in our economy?
I'll just make one quick comment.
Sure.
Thank you. Just very briefly, and I'll have Mr. Cross use most of the time. I'll just say, look, there's a cautionary tale out there, and that's Germany. Germany, in a government which has the Greens as one of their coalition partners, has had to walk back from a very aggressive green agenda. Guess what? The German public realized what the cost would be, and they balked. So, let's be realistic about what we can accomplish in a context of high inflation and a serious crisis in housing and affordability generally.
Well, just to add to that, I mean, Germany came here asking for our LNG. In the last 8 years, this government hasn't been able to even get one project of LNG, even though they have many on their desk. But America, the U.S., has been able to create 7 or 8 projects of those in that 8-year time period. Are we not missing out on not only being able to help reduce world emissions with our low-carbon, responsibly made energy here, and missing out on that boat?
Very much so. I mean, that's what I was alluding to in my opening statement, was you look at the U.S., how they were able to regard what's happened over the last 10 years as an opportunity, and an opportunity to both increase oil and gas production and at the same time lower their emissions. It's not one or the other. And at the same time, they are in a position that when a fellow G7 member comes and asks for help, and Europe was in desperate need of help last winter. I mean, I was there. You walked into buildings in Paris, and it was cold. The temperature was turned way down. These people had a serious shortage of natural gas, which we should have been in a position to help fill. But instead, what we ended up doing was we exported our cheap natural gas to the U.S., which was more than happy to pay nothing for it, while they exported the expensive stuff to Europe and reaped. And then we wonder, gee, why are incomes there? I was reading a paper recently by Pierre Fortin. He was comparing per capita incomes in New York and Quebec. On a purchasing power converted basis, per capita incomes in New York are almost twice as high as in Quebec. That's ridiculous. How does this happen? And I don't know how much long that can go on before people start voting with their feet and saying, if not for myself, for my children, there are better opportunities elsewhere.
And in both of your opinions, we've seen, like I said, we've seen things like a carbon tax that the U.S. doesn't have that, and they've been able to lower their emissions. And Canada's emissions have actually gone up. Are some of these really, bad bills and some of these policies by the Liberal government, are they stifling investment also coming and wanting bigger companies wanting to invest here in Canada?
Yes, indeed. And, I would just echo what we just heard from Mr. Cross. I mean, the basic problem is we have excessive bureaucracy, excessive red tape, we have a high tax environment, we've had loose monetary policy. And, again, if you look at the data, adjusted for, what the cost of living is, and per hour, Canada's basically at the bottom of the league table now in the rich countries of the West. We are way behind Scandinavia, the U.S., Germany, everyone. And that's really shocking.
Maybe if I have any time left, what needs to happen for us to even being able to compete with the rest of the world or even with the U.S.? How do we keep up?
We don't have time for really an answer there. So, but sorry about that, MP Hallen, but we are at the time. And now we're off to MP Thompson for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. And excuse me, I'd like to begin just by once again referencing something my colleague did a moment ago, and it is the severity of the climate crisis. And certainly, I think we need to also acknowledge, and I haven't heard this today, is the real cost of responding to climate extreme weather events, and also understanding that this is impacting every aspect of society. So on that note, I'd like to move to the Agriculture Federation of Canada, and thank you. And I'm sorry I don't have time for everyone today, but if I could just zero in on, if you could, and if both of you could answer to this question on the specifics around the economic impact of forest fires and other extreme weather events on your exports.
Well, that's always the struggle, is it's a guessing game on how that's going to impact long term. We have, many free trade agreements around the world. We are an export nation, and we rely not only on primary agriculture, but the whole agri-food industry. As an example, in Ontario, there are 860,000 people working in the agri-food industry. A good majority of them are in the processing sector. So it affects not just farmers, but it affects the economy of the country a lot. So not being able to fulfill a market potentially means a loss in that market, despite the free trade agreement, because somebody else will come in and fill that market. And the problem with what we're experiencing with the various climate issues is that it takes a long time to recover. So the drought in the prairie provinces isn't just going to be over if we happen to get a little bit of rain or some snow through the wintertime. There's long-standing effects that occur because of that, or the floods that have happened in Atlantic Canada, or the atmospheric river that happened in BC. I mean, you just don't fix that quickly. So it's going to have negative impacts, economic impacts, not only to the farm community, but throughout the entire economy. I mean, the one thing about agriculture is that, we're recession-proof, and we've proven that we're pandemic-proof. And how many industries can say that, right? We continue to do what we need to do to produce food for people both domestically and internationally. And that's a tremendous economic driver. And we need to figure out how to not only maintain that, but to capitalize on that for the economy of the country. I don't know if you want to add anything else, Brody.
Well, the only thing I would add quickly to that is that's part of the basis behind the recommendation around the accelerated capital cost allowance is to create that incentive for farmers to invest in their own equipment, to make them more sustainable and to make them more productive. Because really we see that intersection between food security and climate change. Innovation is right there. I'm sure our colleagues would agree. And so that is a very concrete measure that could be put in place in the short term immediately that would support an investment in capital on farms to make them more productive, to make them more climate resilient, and ultimately support our sustainability objectives.
Thank you. And in your opening remarks, you referenced, which I'm grateful for because I think it's incredibly important, sustainability and the supports needed for intergenerational farm transfers. Would you speak in more detail to that?
Well, there was some measures made in earlier budgets to allow for transfers, intergenerational transfers. The issue becomes that because of the size of farming operations now and because they're multi-generational or large family operations, our businesses are becoming incorporated. We are all small businesses, but we're becoming incorporated because it makes good business sense. But under the current tax laws for transfer, it's now become easier to sell to a stranger than it is to the family, because the capital gains exemption applies to specifically a sole owner, let's say. But when you have several siblings or several family members who are all involved in the business and are owners, you lose that capital gains exemption. So it's, as I said, it's easier to transfer the farm to an individual who's not a family member than keep it in the family. So we're looking for some adjustments in the Tax Act that will allow for that intergenerational transfer and still allow the capital cost exemption to apply.
Well, no, I think that's exactly it. Okay. That, again, I would just highlight is another very concrete, very specific tax amendment that could be made that would support the next generation of farmers that are really inheriting a very difficult situation in this, as we said, this high inflation, high interest rate environment. So that was one of the reasons, that was one of several very specific concrete proposals that we think would have an impact on the short term.
Thank you. Thompson, and now we're going to MP Samari for 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson. That was a great recommendation. I do hope that we follow up on it in short order. I'd like to come back to Mr. Hurtaud. Perhaps you want to respond to Daniel's question, or perhaps Mr. Lopez Aslan, you'd like to continue an explanation of your recommendations. Up to you. Well, I can respond to that question. Thank you, sir. In response to Mr. Blakey's question. So this is a two-pronged answer. Mr. Blakey underscored the fact that it would be an investment to adequately fund the CRA. It would be an investment at the end of the day. In comparison, the big accounting firms will often tell their clients, well, that those kinds of investments in tax services are an investment for the future. And I would advocate for the same kind of thing in the case of the CRA. And there's also a downside to this. This stagnation of the funding of the CRA over many years attests to the Canadian government's lack of willingness and other governments' lack of willingness to tackle head-on the issue of tax havens. So and this is a good segue regarding the funding of the CRA and the mechanisms to tackle tax evasion and tax avoidance schemes. We need great expertise within the CRA in order to make up for, in order to stop these funds from leaving Canada. Now, let me come back to the key issue of tax accords, and this is one of our key demands and recommendations. This is a huge endeavour that I'm referring to. Now, if I could refer to the Supreme Court decision at the Luxembourg, where Justice Côté, who signed the majority opinion, he rejected the call from the CRA and justified it by saying that the root cause of the tax advantage that was being called for by Alternat Luxembourg was, in fact, part and parcel of the tax accord between Canada and Luxembourg. So these tax accords are absolutely riddled with problems, with loopholes that allow these foreign and domestic companies to eschew their responsibilities, to shirk their responsibilities when it comes to their real economic activities. Thank you very much.
MP Sainte-Marie, and now to MP Blakey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. To the Council of Canadian Innovators, we've heard a lot around this table about Canada's low productivity growth compared to its competitors' low business investment. We've also seen over the last 20 years or so a decrease in the corporate tax rate and some pretty sizable capital reserves on the part of Canadian companies. And I'm just wondering, what is it that you think is required of government if there are a lot of companies that do have cash on hand? We've heard about, industrial policy, creating better investment conditions. What do you think are some of the things that are required in order to get Canadian companies to invest in themselves?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Look, I think we have to create the incentives and the freedom to operate for companies to want to invest in that R&D. There are many recommendations that I can offer, but one very concrete one is around reforming the SR&ED tax credit. There was a promise in Budget 2022 to update this nearly 80-year-old program. It's a $4 billion program. And it's integral for our members and for the innovation economy. It is a huge source of capital, of R&D, and it can be a source of intellectual property if it's updated correctly. Where's the consultation? Where is that review and that reform to that critical program? We have not seen it. In fall of 2022, we developed a comprehensive report with companies across Canada to provide 6 concrete recommendations to the government, and we've continued to push the Department of Finance to make good on that promise. But what we've heard behind closed doors that is quite concerning is that nearly half of that program, around $2 billion, goes to about 15 corporate giants. Unfortunately, I can't offer the committee evidence because it's shrouded behind corporate privacy prohibitions. But the point I'm making is that there needs to be transparency for that program. There needs to be an update so that it can help small and medium-sized enterprises.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, MP Blakey, and now to MP Lawrence for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a quick administrative note. Has the Minister of Finance accepted our invitation?
I think we'll look to the PS.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Minister would like to come to committee. We are just working on dates.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Back to our witnesses. So my colleague, Mr. Hallan, finished off his questions and wasn't able to get an answer, so maybe we get an answer. To you, Mr. Cross and Mr. Deja, is what could Canada do concisely, and maybe a point or two each, to enhance our productivity to put Canada in a position to start competing?
My work in this area, I've gone beyond. I think the problem has become so deep-rooted that it's not a matter of changing a policy or a regulation anymore. I'm more and more focused on how it is we talk to and interact with the business community. If we don't change the way in which we talk to these people, we're giving them every reason to leave and go to jurisdictions that are much more business-friendly. So I think it comes down to attitudes and to culture more than policies and politics now.
I mean, I'd second that. I would say that our problems are so structural and so deep-rooted now that a policy tweak here or there won't really make a big difference. We have become a country, sadly, in which entrepreneurship just doesn't thrive, and that's a big problem for us.
Yeah, thank you for that. And you point to some larger concerns, which I think are well founded. And I know Mr. Cross you've written about that, and I've read some excellent articles about that. To get though back to more of a technical concern, one concern I have is that if you've seen the bond market, Canadian corporations are now going to be able to make more money with zero risk, or close to zero risk. I shouldn't say anything, zero risk. And we already have an issue where we don't have, as Mr. Blakey just talked about, companies perhaps putting enough money into investment. So my response would be to lower taxes to give them a greater return when they take risks. Perhaps, as the innovator said, by reworking the SR&ED program. Your comments on that, just as an open question to you, Mr. Deja and Mr. Cross.
My concern is, yes, we're moving into an environment of much higher interest rates, but I think that's generally going to be a more negative economic environment. Yes, it's going to be more profitable to invest in bonds than take a risk in investing in greenfield projects. In that type of environment, I think it's going to be difficult to just tinker at the edges with policies and taxes to get people to take more risk. I think that's where I would go back to. You need much more. That's when you should be starting to work on a culture shift and changing the way we talk to to corporations and entrepreneurs and foreign investors. Sorry.
I just add one comment to that. We lived for 10 years or more with basically free money. So that distorted the economy beyond belief. It was cheaper to just buy property, to invest in risky assets. We got all these property market and these huge asset price bubbles, which is one reason that we're now facing households with debt. And the reality is that money is now costly, and I think households and businesses just have not wrapped their head around how to react to this change.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to switch. I'm going to switch gears and just talk to you, Mr. Curry, for a little bit. Thank you for all the work that you do and the farmers do across the country. I think the best farmers are in Northumberland, Peterborough South, but I might be biased there. But in all seriousness, so one of your recommendations in your submission was, of course, to reduce the carbon tax on all fuels, including natural gas and propane. That's Bill 234 that's currently in the Senate. But I want to talk broader than that. Tiff Macklin said that 0.4% of inflation was directly attributable to the carbon tax. If, in fact, we were able to remove all the carbon tax on your members, would that enable and reduce the input cost and potentially be able to reduce the cost of food in Canada?
Well, I think the easy answer is yes. The one thing about carbon tax is rural Canadians and farmers pay disproportionately more in tax. For those that live in an urban setting, when they walk out the door to go to the grocery store, they have two choices. They get in the car and drive and choose to pay a carbon tax, or they go down the street and get into public transit. We don't have that option. We have to drive everywhere, so we're paying disproportionately more. But from a farming perspective, everyone that gets charged a carbon tax for a service they provide or whatever the case may be puts that added cost onto the products that they're selling to the public. Farmers are price takers, not price setters. We don't have the luxury of passing that cost on. So we just get piled on by more and more service charges that narrows our margins even more. So it would be a definite boost, especially if 234 gets through, and if you can put the push on the Senate to get this through committee quickly, especially on a couple of senators that are holding this up, we'd really appreciate it.
Thank you, MP Lawrence. And now we're actually going to our final questioner. It'll be MP Baker for this session.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chair. I want to start by just making a brief comment. I think that we in Parliament, in this committee, we will disagree. Members will disagree with each other on a range of issues. And when you're in this line of work, you kind of have to learn to let that go. But there's something that I can't let go that was said, and I just need to point it out in the context of what's been discussed here. I have to say that I am, in his last intervention, Mr. Halan was talking about lamenting the fact that Canada wasn't doing enough to bring our emissions down. And I think what frustrates me is that at the same time, his party and his leadership has done everything possible to get in the way of any action to reduce our emissions. And so I think for the folks watching at home, I think it's important that we call that out and that we be clear as parliamentarians, no matter what our views on are any issue, that we're clear about where we stand and what trade-offs we're making. But that really, really, really frustrates me when especially when we know how urgent this climate crisis is. We've heard about the impact that this is having on folks across Canada, economic and otherwise. And so I think if the Conservative Party believes it's important that we act on climate, then I'd love to see their support on measures to act on climate change in this country. With that said...
Point of order, Chair. Arguably, I think the only plan that the Liberals have put forward...
That's not a point of order.
Chair. This is my time. This is my time.
You were not interrupted. Allow MP Baker.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Chair, I hope you'll give me back the time that I've lost because the Conservatives interject. I'm very respectful of members of the Conservative Party when they've sought to make points that to express their disagreement with the government position. I'm now expressing my disagreement, and I would ask that I be given that same courtesy to disagree. Now, in terms of what I wanted to do was come back to our folks from the agriculture community, and I want to ask you about some of the extreme weather events and the economic impact. And this is continuing along the lines of the conversation we were having earlier. Could you talk a little bit about how, and I'm thinking about wildfires specifically, but you may have other examples, but I'm thinking about the wildfires and how has that impacted the prices that your members, that farmers, are able to charge for what they're growing and what they're selling?
Well, I mean, we don't specifically get to charge whatever we want for our products. They're set by markets. And that market comes down, the prices on those markets typically come down to supply and demand. So, we all suffered through the wildfires right across the country early in the year. I don't think there was anyone that didn't step outside their house and could smell smoke in the air. And certainly for our Western colleagues, that's had an even bigger impact because of the severity of the fires. And so it's affected the production of the crops. It's affected people being able to go outside and actually work in their fields. And so there's been productivity loss in that regard as well. Now, it doesn't matter if the price goes through the roof if you don't have the product to harvest to sell on that market. So it's kind of a chicken and egg thing. We like the high prices, but if these weather events are affecting our productivity, then it doesn't matter because we can't take advantage of these markets.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you for that. Yeah. And so on that, and I think I only have about a minute left, but what are the impacts of? You talked earlier about soil health, and so what are the impact of some of these extreme weather events on soil health for farmers?
Well, when you look, it depends on the type of climate crisis or issue that you're talking about. Floods, for example, can have long-term effects because soil moves. And so, we've done a good job for decades now on the sustainability front. Some of our biggest frustration is no one's recognizing what we've been doing over the last number of years. They think we have to do all these things now to solve the problems, but they're not taking into account what we've already done. I had to go plow a field a year ago for an archaeological study on a farm I rented. Do you know how hard it was for me to find a plow? Because nobody plows anymore. Everybody no-tills, right? We no-till because it's good for the soil, it's good for what we do, it's good for economic reasons as well. So as long as we can continue to ramp up those measures of best management practices, and we need things like seed technology development to help improve for wet years and for dry years of our seed genetics in particular, that's going to help the sustainability efforts as well. Fires can also have a long-term effect depending on what comes out of the air into the ground and how that impacts the growth of the crops going forward. And that will also impact livestock farmers if they can't grow the right crops or the more nutritious grasses, et cetera. So it's a multitude of effects that are happening, but the more we can invest in the technology that's going to help us go forward, in particular on soil health, because we don't do one thing, we don't do a thing to sequester more carbon. When we do something for a soil, it has multiple co-environmental benefits. Water retention and movement, nutrient retention, yes, carbon sequestration, and that's really what we need to focus on from a soil health perspective. How do we drive that forward?
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, MP Baker. And that concludes our session. We want to thank our excellent witnesses. We've got labor and innovators and farmers and academics here with us, a real cross-section, and many great questions from our members and answers from our witnesses. Thank you for your testimony on this study, on our pre-budget consultation, and I just want to wish all of you and your families a happy Thanksgiving long weekend. Thank you. We're adjourned.